And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today in this panel. We have Professor Timiebi Agnava, who is an assistant professor of space and society in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, an affiliate faculty with the Interplanetary Initiative, a senior global future scientist with the Global Futures Lab, and holds a courtesy appointment at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, all of this at Arizona State University. She is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, where she focused on environmental and space governance. She is currently on the advisory board for the Space Generation Advisory Council, supporting the UN program on space applications. She is also on the Science Advisory Board of Worldview Enterprises and the SETI Institute. Next, we will have Lindsay Weiser, who is an astrophysics PhD candidate at Arizona State University and deputy lead of the Space Generation Advisory Council's U.S. Task Force for Policy and Advocacy. Lindsay's PhD research focuses on the characterization of exoplanet atmospheres with additional projects in space and science policy. In 2019, Lindsay was awarded the Brooke Owens Fellowship for Women and Gender Minorities in Aerospace. And now I give the floor to our two speakers today.
Good morning, everyone. This is Timmy, and today you're going to see what it really looks like to be a working mom, because my daughter is home and so she's joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation that is essentially going to be a conversation between teacher and student. When we were told about this conference and we really thought about the purpose behind it, talking about space education, we thought it would just be interesting to maybe just show how you teach and what it is that people have to think about to actually do this work of space governance. And we thought the best way to do it is not to just spend the whole hour just giving you facts or information, but really to just have a dialogue that we want you to be a part of. So we really want this to be an engaging discussion. Let's even see if we can even have some outcomes by the end of this discussion, so we can say that we were well served by this hour. And the reason that I think this is so important is because when I look at the other sessions that you could have joined this morning, the wonderful Professor Hilding, who talks about indigenous perspectives and being able to go from exploitation to relationship. And then Charles's presentation that is talking about the legal regimes applicable to space debris, ownership rights, environmental mindsets, liability, etc. So you guys have chosen to be here instead of there. So let's use this hour. Let's actually make it mean something. And so we would love to start this off by having some engagement. Maybe you can go in the chat, or you can, put your hand up to speak. But we want to know, have you heard this term space governance before? And what does it mean to you? Is there a distinction between space law, space policy, space governance, or is it just a bunch of words? That's what we would love by the end of this presentation or this discussion, that you would be able to speak intelligibly about, is there a distinction between all these terms? So please go ahead in the chat, or someone raise your hand and tell us, have you even ever heard this term before? What does it mean to you? Okay,
I think
so
you'll be promoted to panelists as well. So anyone who would like to join and kind of speak, you should be able to if you accept that.
I'm in the process of promoting everyone to panelists, so feel free to join in as you see fit.
Excellent, great. So we have a good group here. There's 29 of us. So it's small enough that we can be very intimate here. We are not sitting here as some kind of experts. We're sitting here as facilitators of a dialogue. So that's why we're encouraging you, as you have thoughts, let's all be here to learn together. right? And so as you have thoughts, as you have questions, put them in the chat, raise your hand. You know, this is a space education workshop. It's not a fact gathering place. Okay, so with that, I will throw it to Lindsay to take over.
Yeah, so we do have a few slides, but we'll go through them sort of casually, and we'll have a back and forth. But before I pull those up, did anyone have any thoughts about kind of their impression of what space governance is? And give a couple seconds if anyone wants to speak in. I will share my screen. Okay. Well, definitely feel free to chime in at any moment. I will leave the slides out of presenter mode so we can move around them pretty easily. So yeah, this is to get us thinking about what space governance is. This is a project, a paper Timmy and I wrote a year or so ago now, thinking about space governance and how it influences different debates that go on within the space community, and thoughts about kind of the ethics of what we should or shouldn't do. And so here is how Timmy and I have thought about the space governance system so far. This figure you see has evolved and changed quite a bit throughout our numerous conversations about it. But essentially, we see kind of international laws at the center. They have a lot to say about all the other areas. They're pretty foundational. But surrounding that, we also have non-binding agreements at the international level. And then we have national laws, so more localized laws, national policies, so, you know, maybe non-binding or changing, evolving policies in a regional area. And then beyond that, we have stakeholder interactions. So that includes interactions between private companies, discussions, and a lot of the times policies that become laws on the national or international level. They start out in these interactions. And so this is how we conceptualize the governance system as a whole, going beyond just space law. Timmy, do you want to chime in?
Exactly. So what I want to chime in here is basically that the McGill University in Canada did the first global space governance study, right? Comprehensive, 3-year project on space governance. And I summarize how they define space governance as basically instruments, legal instruments or non-legally binding instruments, institutions, so like the UN, Congress, whatever, and processes. And that makes a lot of sense. But I think what was really missing from that was the importance of the interactions and the interrelations between stakeholders. And this is what you'll see is like a more of a new evolution in the study of space law, which is why we're now saying space governance is where we're going, because we're now integrating those mindsets that those stakeholders have and how they engage with the process and the institutions to actually affect what the law is. And so there's increasing people that are working in this domain of space governance. So, Indiana University have a space governance lab where, the director there, Etienne Tepper, looks at the different suppliers of governance, right? At Texas A&M, they talk about the adaptive space governance system and all the feedback loops that go into thinking about the laws and the policies and the institutions. Michael Byers and Erin Bowley at the University of British Columbia bring science and law as equal partners, right? Thinking about how do people use these different disciplines to affect a particular kind of change that they want. And then other scholars like M.J. Rubenstein at the Wesleyan University look at, say, the religious roots of the space endeavor and how the people interact and engage with these processes. So I think if there's one thing to take away about the defining thing about space governance that separates it from space law and space policy is really this centrality of subjectivity. Who is the player that you're talking about? What is their intent? Why are they engaging in the system, in the institutions, etc.? Does anyone have anything to add to thinking about that, or any questions about how we might have got there? Please add it in the chat or raise your hand.
Here's a question that might be related to this current slide and what you, Timothy, were talking about earlier. A question from Mark Florentino. How do national borders extend into space? Is this considered space policy?
National borders extend to space significantly. For instance, Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty says that the state of registry shall retain jurisdiction and control of any space objects or space or personnel in space, right? Which means if there's a spacecraft, the law of the country that sent the spacecraft is what applies in that spacecraft and in all the spaces around it. So for instance, if you go to the International Space Station, which has modules from different countries, well, there's not one law of the space station. The law of the module that you're in is the law of the country that owns that module. So definitely Earth national laws do extend to space. Lindsay, do you have anything to add?
All I would add to that is to say that when we have this diagram here, we're talking about national policies and laws. Those include, and international, these include laws that specifically mention and are intended to apply to space, but they also include a lot of laws and regulations that don't mention space at all. And maybe space didn't even exist as a place where humans were going or anything when they were conceptualized, and yet they apply now, right?
Yeah.
So space governance does not just include regulations that were designed to include space. It also includes things that were never designed to include space.
Yes, that's a really great point. And even though you can't hold me on saying which laws that are not space laws apply in space, but Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty says all international law, well, not all, international law and the charter, the UN charter, applies in space. The question is which international laws, which context? That is not decided upon, but it was determined that actually general laws can be applied to space. So what you'll see, there's a trend right now that people are thinking, okay, how does environmental law apply to space, as an example? And so there was a court case where, you know, Viasat was trying to take the Federal Communications Commission to court, saying that the NEPA Act, which is the National Environmental Protection Act, should apply to satellites. But I think that case has actually been overturned right now. Maybe Lindsay was going to speak to it, but yeah, that's just an example. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, so I was going to say that I think that kind of leads well into this slide, which we had from this previous presentation, where we talk about the different mindsets in space, right? So actors in space can have a lot of different mindsets when they're going into it. What is it for? What are they trying to get out of being in space? And those mindsets are going to guide their activities, as well as what laws and policies they see as applying in space. And so, you know, these mindsets can include defense and domain oriented, expansion and utilization, scientific mindsets, which are often there, but typically are not kind of the dominating mindset that a lot of people have. And then this environment oriented one that Timmy just mentioned that is gaining popularity and through that case.
Mm-hmm. And so these, you know, it's really interesting because since we did this work, and Lindsay, I don't even know if we've even talked about this, but my thinking about mindset has evolved so much because my current PhD students have psychology backgrounds. So now it's like really even thinking about this mindset thing, not just as these broad disciplines, but if we're talking about these stakeholders, what is actually driving them? Because if you look at a lot of the narratives in space, right, a lot of these narratives are simply quite strange. The whole manifest destiny thing, and like, what is making people think the way they think about space? And like MJ Rubinstein's, the Wesleyan University, for instance, I told you her work is on the religious roots. And all her assessment is just like, there's so many weird mythology in space discourse. And so it's very, especially before we talk about all this work, we're talking about equity and inclusion and bringing in new actors. We have to be really sure what those mindsets are that we have in space that got us here. And do they fit in with all these people that you're trying to force into the space sector by hook or by crook? Let's bring in Black women and let's bring in, all these people. If you don't understand the mindset that exists with the space community and the way people think, then all these people that you're going to bring in are just going to be in shock, right? Because, they may not have played into the narratives of Star Trek and Star Wars their whole lives, right? And all these things. Go ahead, Lindsay.
No, I think that's a fantastic point. And so kind of the mindsets that existed at the start of venturing into space, they no longer necessarily speak to people now. This idea of going for the sake of defense and protecting our country and national interests, a lot of those things may not speak to the current generation. What speaks to the current generation could be, it could be a more environmental mindset. How do we use this for our own planet? It could be an inclusive mindset, as Timmy was mentioning. And so we just have to be very aware as new people are coming in, how does that mindset transform? And how do we have these conversations and know what the other person is talking about if we're both coming from different backgrounds?
Absolutely. And just to add to that, we talk a lot about sustainability. I think you'll get to that slide, and what space sustainability means. It's like a massive buzzword. And it's funny because if you stay in your bubble, sustainability means a certain thing. And yesterday, I decided to go into some of the really hardcore scientific conferences, and all of them were using sustainability in a completely different way to all the other conferences that I've been to. They were talking about sustainability in terms of how do we keep our mission going? How do we make sure there's like return on investments? Whereas all the conferences I go, when you say space sustainability, people are talking about space debris, right? And all these things. And when I first started studying space sustainability, people were talking about security risk. Like if there's like satellites like coming close to other people's satellites, that's not sustainable. So like these words matter. And I think the interesting thing about being a lawyer and what I push to my students is that, words are actually weapons. Words are powerful. Words can cause wars, right? And if you don't understand the mindset or the intent of a particular player, you may be saying a bunch of words that you think don't have any connotations, and they are heavily loaded words, right? So one of the most important things that, Lindsay and I talk about is the importance of transdisciplinarity and like making sure that you continuously engage with people either from different disciplines or from different places, because then you find out that, guess what? The word sustainability in ecology means something from sustainability to a business person, which means something different to a lawyer. Right, Lindsay?
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect example. And that's something I'm here at IAC in Paris, International Astronautical Congress. And that's something that we'd actually talked about here recently, is that sustainability can mean so many different things to so many different people. And so I do think that that's a perfect example of what we were trying to say with that. Does anyone want to chime in with any questions before we keep going?
And you guys know I'm a teacher, so I might just put some people on the spot, but it would be really interesting to, see if there's anyone in the room who like has acknowledged like a particular mindset with the way that they've been taught about space, or for instance, the people who teach, there is a big difference between people who say, I have loved space since I was 3 years old, right? Than somebody who, like me, who fell into space. I fell into space working in Africa. That mindset, like the way I approach everything as someone who fell into space from a developing country standpoint, is going to be very different than someone that grew up in America and loved space since they were 3 years old. Right. So
like me.
Yeah. So if people are not, but the beauty of people like Lindsay is the awareness that she has, an awareness of who she is, what's been her influences, and has gone out of being like a pure scientist to look for other perspectives, to look for other views, which is very rare, right? Because that kind of mindset and that kind of way of operating is not, what do they call it? Not that it's not valued, but it's not recognized, right, Lindsay?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that a lot of times, the space industry is small and a lot of us talk to each other, but there are also bubbles. And it takes a little bit of initiative to step out of the bubble and to have a conversation with somebody who is engaging with space in a different way than you. And I think that that's something that's really valuable about this conference, right? Is that it's bringing people who exist perhaps in different bubbles to talk about governance, which includes all the bubbles.
Exactly. And I do see, panelists, we have a couple of people, Stephen, Taylor, Thomas, Trevor, Vitali. Like, we would love this to be an engaging conversation, and just what are some of your thoughts on what we're saying, and any questions that you might have. I don't know if you're educators or your students or your policy people, but if we know where you're coming from, we may be able to address specific topics, because the beauty of our experience in this room between me and Lindsay is that, I have worked in, government, think tank, law firm, academia, nonprofit, in 5 different countries, in 4 different functions, and Lindsay is like my go-to scientist. Who's also worked, in policy circles. So we have a lot of insight, but we need the questions, we need the engagement so that you guys really get what you need out of this conference. In the context, we're talking about space education, we're talking about what is space governance, we're talking about how do we increase participation, or how do we even acknowledge what some of the flaws may be, or what some of the challenges may be to get people to be interested in space or to be able to make it in space. Am I missing any other goals, Lindsay?
No, I think that sounds great. Let's maybe
Okay.
pause for 5 seconds to see if anyone wanted to add anything or ask any questions, and then I can go to the next slide.
Lindsay, I think you can go on. There are a couple of questions in the Whova, but I think they might be related to some of your later slides, so we can tackle them in a few minutes if you like.
Okay, sure. Yeah, since I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see the Whova, so if someone else could definitely.
Yeah, no, I'm monitoring
tell them
that,
to
so
me.
I'll be
Okay,
passing along the
perfect.
questions.
Okay, perfect. Well then, yeah, so this one it connects to like a lot of things we were just saying, so we can just briefly go over it. But essentially, a lot of debates and disagreements that come up when we talk about space, often they stem from these different mindsets. And so in this work, what Timmy and I did was to try to summarize some of the key points, the key arguments on either side of debates that many of us are very aware of that are actively going on in the space industry, and to hopefully kind of clarify where the other side is coming from, since we all come in with our biases. So yeah, so the first one that Timmy and I discussed was kind of mega constellations versus a pristine sky. So do we put huge constellations of satellites in space, or do we preserve that for the sake of a quiet sky or astronomy or whatever that might be? Timmy, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, and so the interesting thing, this mega constellations debate, there's so many angles to it when I put my developing country hat on, because at the end of the day, everyone that I speak to says internet access for everyone in Africa is going to be a game changer. And not only that, what, for instance, Starlink and some of these other people are trying to do is, I don't know how to explain it. I think, did you see in the news they had like SpaceX and some teleco company, like that was in the news like maybe 2 weeks ago, trying to make you be able to use existing structures, right, to connect with the satellites. And I think even like Apple just launched something on their phones, right, that you can, get internet access from anywhere using satellites. So like this could be a huge game changer, right? And so from a space, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, obligation that space should be used for the benefit and interest of all countries. Yeah, it makes sense. Let's all work towards internet access all across the world. But when we talk about balancing competing interests, because no one can say that providing internet access around the world through mega constellation is a more worthy goal than astronomy, which we know is the foundation. I mean, Lindsay, you can speak to this. I don't know. You can tell us about why astronomy is important, but isn't it like the foundation of everything that we know about the universe? Like, so how are you going to manage the fact that these people are saying mega constellations could be really bad for astronomy? And so that's kind of like our job, is that it's like, we just have to figure out how to all talk together and understand that everything everyone wants to do is valid, but we cannot all do everything at once or without consultations or talking to each other or understanding people's views, right? And this is where conflict happens, when people don't do that, right?
Yeah, no, I think so. This particular debate really illustrates how there are different goals and different mindsets about what we're trying to get out of space, and how do we decide which of those have the most merit, which of those values do we value over the others.
Here's a question that might be related, I think, to this question of who decides. The question is, do we currently have an agency that can take the responsibility of global representation in space, or will that need to be created? And I guess following up on that question, should we even be considering creating one? Or what are your thoughts on decision-making in space?
What do you think, Lindsay?
I'll let you take that one first.
Okay, so, the original ultimate place that people think of is the United Nations, right? It's like, okay, if you're saying that space is this massive global thing that like doesn't belong to anyone, and like there should be some place that, is like the place that decides what things happens, then, people will think of the United Nations. But the irony of the United Nations is now, with over 190 countries, it's kind of deadlocked in so many different issues, right? Like, the Outer Space Treaty could not be negotiated today. If you think about the fact that when it was negotiated, there were only 2 countries that could actually have any space capability. And I think space law is one of the fastest laws in international law that was developed. So from when the Sputnik launched, there was like a UN committee immediately, and then there was like an outer space treaty within 10 years. So it's like, that's like the speed of light. But the thing is, the activities that they were thinking about that were going to be feasible within that sphere of time is very different from what's going on today. And I don't think anyone would have thought that there would be, over 80 countries with space agencies. Right. If you look at the United Nations Register of Space Objects, which shows you how many objects have been registered that have been launched since 1950s, there are about 11,000. Meanwhile, SpaceX alone have licenses for 40,000 satellites. right? So it's just, everything is just massive. And so some people are like, if you're gonna, and we need to think about coordination, like space traffic management, because if you have 100,000 satellites and there's no rules of the road, no one knows who has right of way, what you're supposed to do. So is the future of space, all these visions we have, is it sustainable if we do not have an institution that is governing that? You know, that is the big question. And many people don't want such an institution because they want freedom in space. And others say, is it even possible to do all these things people are talking about without an institution that has some power? Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, so what I will add to that is, of course, the United Nations is what people think of, but the United Nations is certainly influenced more by some countries than others. And so the United Nations is intended to have this kind of international best interest. But the people defining what that best interest is are still strongly biased towards a select few nations. And so that idea kind of exists, but in practice, it's not quite being implemented.
I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. Do you want to progress with your slides, or do any of these questions speak to any of your next slides? There's one here about colonization. Do we have a slide about colonization? I think we had.
We do have an expansion.
Okay, so yeah, Trevor's question, if SpaceX and Elon Musk are successful in colonizing Mars, would international law apply to colonizing other planets, or would Mars be considered under its own jurisdiction? Who would be authorized to enforce those laws? So can you go to your slide on the debates around colonization, etc., and then we can use that to have a discussion.
Yeah, I mean, so I think
is it protection versus expansion? Is it protection versus expansion? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the one that I think I have it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a huge question, right? I mean, there are so many different factors at play in that question. So Timmy, I don't know if you want to take a first stab, or I can talk about what the protection versus expansion.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts, and I'll build on that.
Yeah, so the protection versus expansion debate that we include mostly has to do with when we're expanding into space, what are the motivations for doing that? What's the purpose of sending humans rather than robots? And debates in favor of expansion will often argue that humans can do more science than robots can, or humans are inherently explorers, or there's economic benefits of resources, moving industry off of Earth that may be harming climate. So those are some kind of big arguments from those supporting expansion. And then those supporting protection may argue things like preserving bodies for science, planetary protection, so being concerned about taking life to another planet or accidentally bringing it back that could be harmful, or having anti-colonialist perspectives. You know, there's been a lot of issues that have arisen out of expansion on our planet, so we should be more careful going to others, or just saying it's not worth the cost and the risks of sending people. It's not worth our time. There's other things to be worried about here rather than sending people elsewhere. So that's the debate that we mostly addressed in our,
And I think, so first of all, Trevor, like in some circles, if you say the word colonizing, like you're going to get in a lot of trouble. So settling Mars, right, Lindsay? Is that what we're supposed to say? Yeah. So, you know, I think maybe during the pandemic, there was that big hoo-ha. I don't know if any of you heard about it, where basically SpaceX put in their terms of service for Starlink. So basically in the Starlink contracts, I don't know, like if we can pull up the actual text, but they put in there something about the fact that when we get to Mars, Earth laws won't apply. right? And we will make the law or something crazy like that. And it's funny because half the people can just be like, well, what a joke, like obviously. But it's funny because as if you study space governance, you then know, as Etienne Tepper said, there are now different suppliers of space governance. So who knows what's actually going to crystallize, right? And if you put your intent somewhere and a whole bunch of people support that and say, for instance, it represents subsequent practice under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, for instance, then you never know what's going to crystallize, right? And at this point, it's all still evolving. Right now,
Yes.
States will not even consider losing any power. So at the end of the day, if Elon Musk is going to get people to Mars, he is still going to have to get a license from the US to launch those people. And so I cannot, so the law is still going to apply to him, right? Your deeper question is about enforcement. How are we going to enforce any kind of law when isn't Mars like 2 years away, Lindsay?
Oh, I don't know exactly, but
like a year away or something like that. So nothing can happen like in real time, right? So what does enforcement look like if you do have a settlement on Mars and they don't want to do what you say on Earth? I mean, this is also why mindset matters, because clearly they're a little bit loony if they just decide that, oh, we're not going to listen to Earth and we're going to be on Mars and do our own thing, because it seems to me like anyone on Mars is going to be dependent on Earth for a very, very long time.
Yes, I think that's a huge point, right? I think the big thing, the big answer to this question is all depends on precedent, and the precedent is still being set. And so we don't know exactly what will happen, what laws will apply, who will enforce, because all that depends on precedent, and kind of the people who get there first are the ones who get to start setting the precedent. And so we don't know. But Timmy's point about the fact that if there were settlements on Mars, they would be hugely dependent on Earth. And so from that perspective, they will have to abide by a subset of rules, or else they may not have that support.
Awesome. Samson Arawale, this question is for Timiobi. Can you speak briefly on African satellite capacity and limitations? No, I can't. Louis, I work in space defense. If enemy satellites are encroaching US airspace, would that be a violation of any international law? What do you think that means, Lindsay?
Well, I think the question perhaps is relating to if you have enemy satellites orbiting directly above the US. My first initial reaction to that question would be satellites are orbiting, and so there will be satellites from nations that we disagree with orbiting above the US. I think that's pretty much a given. And that's not a violation. That's just what happens as a result of orbital dynamics. However, there may be a kind of a follow-on question here that relates to satellites that maybe get too close to US satellites. What would be the repercussions of that? Yeah, so maybe you can talk about that.
Wow, spoken like a true lawyer, my dear. I was gonna say, the funny thing about this whole, like, I read that question and I see encroaching US airspace as, well, no one has decided where the boundary is between space and airspace. Right. So at what point do you determine an encroachment has happened? Like, how do you define encroachment? Is encroachment that, you are at like 60 kilometers? Like, when do you define encroachment? And so that's what I think of when you say US airspace. But I think Lindsay hit it on the head by saying, what you might mean by airspace is basically US territory, which would be essentially anywhere close to any of their objects, right? So a satellite or a base. And this is where all the discussions are happening right now around safety zones under the Artemis Accords. So the Artemis Accords is the latest US instrument that talks about, do you have anything, are you going to speak on that, Lindsay, anywhere?
I not that specifically, but we do have a slide about data sharing, which includes sharing of the locations of satellites in orbit. So
awesome. Okay. So I'll let you talk about that. But yeah, so the point is, you know, if an enemy satellite is getting too close to you, where you might want to say, if a damage occurs, then under the Liability Convention, which is a 1979 treaty, basically any damage that occurs in space is a fault-based liability system. The problem is to determine that someone is at fault of something, there has to have been something that they've actually breached. And right now, there's no rule that says that you can't get close to someone else to be able to determine a breach that you can say is the faults that caused your damage. Was that a complicated way of explaining it, Lindsay? Like,
no, I think that that's good. Yeah, I mean, so all I was going to add on with this slide was that another one of the debates we discuss is data sharing versus privacy. And so arguments to support kind of having public data about everything in space is that having complete data is really important for situational awareness. If you have a really crowded orbit, not knowing exactly where a satellite is can pose a lot of problems for not running into it. And so data sharing is really important for situational awareness. However, on the flip side, there are pro-privacy arguments that say the exact opposite. Yes, you don't know the exact location of my satellite, and I want it that way because it's secret. It's doing, maybe it's a spy satellite, maybe it's super important for communications for that nation, and they don't want enemy states to know where it is because they don't want it to be a risk. And so that is a debate that is often had. Often having complete situational awareness data is the direction that we go in, but there are some objects with more information than others, just because some objects may be more sensitive than others.
And I think Space Policy Directive 5, or don't quote me on that, was focused on trying to move space situational awareness capability from the defense to the Department of Commerce. Because, right now it's like there are so many things that, the US government have access to with respect to, the risk of collision, whatever. And they were kind of saying, that should be not in a military domain. It's going to be easier to share that information if it's in a civilian agency. So now what you're going to see in the news is that power has gone from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce. Did you read about that, Lindsay?
I hadn't.
Yeah.
Well, so we have a couple follow-up questions going back to the protection and expansion debates. Maybe we can answer those and then go on to some other things.
Okay.
So one of them.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so one of them, we have a question from Thomas Cashin who says, who should arbitrate disputes over resources in space? How do we best protect our national interests?
So there's obviously two parts to this question. The first one is, it's a particular kind of mindset that the issue is about protecting a national interest. So obviously some of us are internationalists, so we're working more towards how do we figure out how to make space a bit less nationalistic and more, what's the word? Like more about how do we spread the benefits of space between all people. So your question is in the line
or just quickly, how do we, rather than thinking about protecting national interests, thinking about protecting the interests of people more so, right? Because national interests are going to be different for everybody.
Right. So, you know, and this answer is going to differ because Lindsay just said it, because different nations have different things. One of the biggest eye-openers that I got is that when I decided to study international law, I was an internationalist. And I was like, I love the world. And then you find out that international lawyers are primarily trying to make sure that the international doesn't encroach on the national. So the irony is, I was like, okay, people who study international law must care about the world. And then you find out, no, international lawyers all work for a country trying to make sure that the international doesn't disturb the country. Isn't that interesting? And so, you know, space is unique in that a lot of the discussions that you'll see are people who have an international mindset. But when you get into it with respect to the people that actually are doing the work, then it's about protecting their national interests, as you say. So that's why, like I said, you have to be in different rooms to understand that the room that you're in, that context might only be a little bit, which is why we study space governance as a complex adaptive system, right? It's not about, you have to look at the whole. There are different components. And so there are different issues going on in each one of those levels of the system. And then when you add them together, the question from complex adaptive systems theory is, do you get something different when you now combine them all? Like, what is the difference between the components and the whole? That's what we're studying.
I would also say that the term national interest is a bit too broad, right? Because even within one nation, you will have multiple interests. And so that gets back to the mindset. There are going to be some people in the United States, for example, who think it's a great thing to go and start mining on the moon and Mars. And then there will be some people who think it's far more important to protect those areas for science and for numerous other reasons. And so then what national interest isn't actually particularly definable even within one nation. And it may change with who's leading the nation as well. So in the US, from one presidential administration to the next, that national interest could be different.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you for that nuance. What else do we have? Trevor's question, it's a follow-up. If SpaceX is dependent on Earth and held accountable to follow Earth laws even on Mars, is it then lawful to cut off support to SpaceX if humans are now dependent on resources from Earth to survive? I mean, that's like killing them, right? I mean, if we cut off resources, I don't think we can kill them. Yeah, how would you go ahead answering that question?
I think the answer, there isn't an answer, because like you said, so many of these things are incredibly undefined, especially for something like settlement on Mars, which is a long time into the future, despite what we may hope, or some people may hope. It is going to take a while to get there. And so that is a ways into the future, and most of the laws associated with it are fairly undefined. I think the chances of just cutting them off so they no longer have resources, I think that likely would not happen, because typically there's a mindset of not killing other people. But I don't have a whole lot to say to that beyond those points, simply because it is so far into the future and so undefined as of yet.
But the interest, I'm trying to, because I want to answer people's questions. So I'm trying to, how do we rephrase that question so it's more, we can give a better answer? So one way that I can reframe that question is to think about the moon, because that's a little bit closer, right? And the International Space Station, for instance. So if on the International Space Station, you do a crime, right? Like, or they have a revolt or something, at the end of the day, they are going to be coming back down to earth. So they would face the penalty when they get back. Right? So it's not that they would shut off the supply in the International Space Station. They would keep the supplies going. But when those people came back down to earth, they would face the wrath. Yeah. The difference with Mars is, yeah, like if people are going to Mars, it's like a one-way mission, or it's going to take like 2 years before they come back.
The other thing I'd add, and correct me on this, but I believe there's something in the Outer Space Treaty or another document that says there's an obligation to assist if someone is
the rescue agreement. The rescue agreement.
Yeah. And so that may also apply here, right? If we have an agreement that you have to assist when someone is in trouble, even if they're not your nation, that may also apply. So maybe you can explain more what that actually is, because
brilliant.
You probably know better than me.
You are brilliant. I didn't even think of that. Yes, exactly. So astronauts are envoys of mankind, which means they represent mankind. So everyone is under an obligation to help any astronaut and in any way possible. So yeah, but someone could now argue like a space tourist or a Martian is not an astronaut. Because there's this idea that, and this is the debate that we're having, say, about these Blue Origin astronauts and these commercial astronauts. Are they actually astronauts? Like, what does it actually mean to be an astronaut? And basically, based on space law right now, an astronaut is personnel. Like, they work for the government. So does the obligation of the rescue agreement that you have to help astronauts who are envoys of mankind, does it apply to commercial space explorers? That's a question.
Yep. That is a good question. And I think that's something that will probably need to be addressed at some point, as there are more commercial space explorers, is maybe expanding that agreement to include those who are not official astronauts associated with their national agency, space agency.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Ooh, we got another one.
Do you still see the Outer Space Treaty as a viable means of preventing the weaponization of space, or should new legislation be implemented? Are you going to make me answer that one, Lindsay?
Go for it. I'll chime in afterwards.
So the Outer Space Treaty, some people say, is probably the greatest arms control agreement that there's ever been, because we've never actually had any space weaponization. The issue becomes, how do you define a space weapon? Right? So if you go to the Conference on Disarmament, which is the big conference in Geneva that talks about all this stuff, they're like stuck on the definition of a space weapon, because guess what? This carrot that my daughter was just eating could be a weapon in space, right? It depends on what you want to use that thing for, right? Because even an object the size of a flick of paint, because of the speed in which it's moving, can destroy someone's satellite. So there's a real challenge with actually defining weaponization. But what's happened with the Outer Space Treaty in Article 4, saying that there can be no weaponization of space, even though they're talking there about weapons of mass destruction, right? It has held people off. Now, has it held people off because they didn't have the capability to do it? So what we've seen over the past few years, for instance, is the trend of anti-satellite testing, right? I think India was the last country to do it. And so states will still, if they have the capacity, kind of like nuclear, will still want to show they have this capacity because of strength. So no one is going to ban weaponization of space. But the US just had this new policy to try and, put a ban on testing, or put a ban on, people say testing that causes debris. But no one is trying to ban weaponization of space in totality, because people still want the freedom. to protect their national interest. What do you think?
No,
Should
I think
new
that's a
legislation
good point.
should new legislation be implemented, Lindsay?
That depends. Should it or could it? I don't think it ever could, really. I think having new legislation preventing weaponization, regardless of whether or not I believe it should happen, I'm not sure it could, at least not in a strict sense, for the exact reason that you just said, is nations want to maintain the freedom to be able to put something into space to protect themselves. And so to truly limit weaponization, we would need new legislation, and we'd need a clear definition of what weaponization is and what is and isn't allowed. So yes, we would, but could that actually happen, at least now? I think that's pretty unlikely. There's another question that
I'm wondering
relates
how
to
much
this.
time we have left. Can someone tell us how much time we have left?
You have about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. We've got lots of time. Guys, keep throwing your questions.
There's a related question about are there any other US military space capabilities you think should be civilian run? Take that.
I'm not sure that I really know many of the military space capabilities, but I think the only way I can answer that question is when I saw the debates around the formation of the Space Force and whether it should be kind of people who are like Coast Guards, you know, more like people who are less the way they use the language of like secure US dominance in space vis-a-vis, you know, it's a capability about just figuring out how to ensure that we can all cooperate together and like, you know, I don't know. I haven't thought about that so much. Have you thought about that, Lindsay?
I can't say I've thought about this one a lot. I would guess that by military space capabilities, we are typically talking about what the Space Force serves as now, which is essentially protecting our current satellites, a lot of situational awareness and making sure we don't hit anything or nothing hits us. But I can't say I've thought a whole lot about whether or not that should be civilian run.
And I think some of the things that I'm thinking of that the military were working on were things like, oh my God, I'm trying to wreck my brain, but like stuff about redundancy and resilience, right? Because in their mindsets, they're thinking about, right? Like they're thinking about things like dual use satellites are super important because if you have a satellite that the military are using and are dependent on, that you also have like schools using, like, then people are less likely to blow it up because it's not a purely military object, right? I think under the law, the law of war, you can only blow up something that is a purely military object, right? Which is why, you know, everyone was so mad at Russia during this war because they were like blowing up hospitals and stuff like that. Russia's justification being, yeah, it's a hospital, but it's like a front, right? And so they think it's a legitimate military target. And then others were like, no, it's a hospital. You can't blow it up. I think I've probably gone further than what that question asked, but the point is just saying that it's just going to be difficult because I think that at the end of the day, it's like, so far, the military has been the biggest user of space, right? And I think they said the Iraq war was like the first like space war because it was like pretty much completely helped by space assets. So there's still always going to be this need for the military to have overall control over the domain, right? But you know, maybe because of the structures and because, for instance, I mean, I've got this paper where I'm talking about there have been some people that have discussed that space should be seen as critical infrastructure, right? Have you seen those debates? Like, because I think there's something like 16 to 20 industries in America that the Homeland Security have said, these are critical infrastructure, which means that designation means they have a whole bunch of powers around it. So a bunch of people are like, well, clearly space is critical infrastructure. The interesting thing is when you now declare something as critical infrastructure, even though it has a bunch more protections, it has now a bunch more bureaucracy. And if you also have the goal of increased commercialization of space and increased activity, at the same time, you now make it critical infrastructure, there's going to be a lot more barriers to like funding and like projects and like things like that than there already is, which we know are significant anyway, right?
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Let's see, do we have other questions we haven't gotten
Can
to?
anyone claim mineral rights on the moon in order to mine specific areas?
Well, so my first kind of point to this, as someone who comes from a science background, I think a lot about planetary protection and kind of what we can and can't do in certain areas. And so I don't actually know the specific designations on the moon in specific regions, but in general, on a planetary body, often there are areas that are fully protected. We can't do anything there. But then there are also regions called, what are they called? There are protected regions, and then there's designated areas where we can do more activities, like things like mining. So I think it will likely depend on where we're talking about. But the moon has more open areas than Mars will, for example. Mars has a huge number of protected regions, whereas the moon is a bit more open for activities when in regards to planetary protection.
Mm-hmm. So it's a super interesting question because the big legal debate has been around Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that there can be non-appropriation of anywhere in space by occupation, by sovereignty, or by any other means. The issue is claiming mineral rights the same as claiming ownership? And we're still debating that because on the one hand, the American position is that clearly we may have put a flag on the moon, which is the symbol of appropriation, but hey, it's just a symbol. We're not actually appropriating. But just because we go and exploit somewhere and use our efforts to take resources out does not mean that we claim ownership of that land. What we will claim ownership of is the resource that we have taken out. And they love to use the fish, the ocean, as an example to say, okay, the fish is all in the sea. No one owns all the fish. But if you go to the middle of the ocean and you take out the fish and you bring it back, you own the fish. The irony is, if you guys actually see how many treaties are about fisheries, that will just basically put this whole argument into naught. Because even just 2 weeks ago at the World Trade Organization, there was a massive treaty about banning like subsidies on fisheries because people are taking so much fish from the ocean and then subsidizing it that we're losing all the fish. Or there's a bunch of regional treaties, there's a bunch of fishery management stuff. So when people use this example that space is like the ocean and anyone can go take fish, I'm like, just go look at all the treaties that are trying to ensure that we don't completely deplete all the oceans. So all that to say is, right now, it's not clear what the legal regime will be, but clearly there will have to be one. It doesn't make sense that there's not, because the clear example from life, without a regime, there's going to be overexploitation and there's going to be conflict.
I hadn't heard that example. That's really interesting. I'm curious to learn more about the fish. But I guess a follow-up question from that would be, knowing now that there's very little precedent, if, say, you had the capability to go to the moon right now and take minerals, could you do that? And could anyone stop you?
Yeah.
Knowing that right now there is not substantial precedent.
Yeah. The first and the wisest thing you can do is to hire me and Lindsay to come up with a benefit sharing arrangement for your project. Right. So what I mean by that is the law is unsettled, right? But sometimes someone just has to do something that people can talk about to come to an agreement, right? And so, like, because you don't want there to be this just status quo where nothing happens. So someone has to be bold enough to make that first move. But make sure you're not just a bunch of white dudes sitting together, like talking about how you're going to take all these resources because you want to create precedent. You at least, and I guess the best example of this is really talking about, why do companies have corporate social responsibility, and why do they build schools and communities, and why do they do all those things? So yes, someone is probably going to just have to do something. And then when they do something, everyone is going to say, could they do that? Is that legal? Why should they do that? So, but I think it would behoove those people to make sure that they have as wide conversations as possible, and make sure that there are so many benefits that are going to come out of this project, right? Because that is going to make it more difficult to like challenge. But of course, which company is going to take that on?
And this reminds me of a year or two ago when there was NASA put out a call asking for some private company to go pick up some regolith and bring it back. But I actually have no idea what happened with that. Did anyone take up that call?
Oh, Lindsay, I must tell you about this. So essentially, NASA decided that they were going to create legal precedent through some contracts that they were going to award up to a maximum of $25,000 to people to take some lunar soil, to put it in a specified location, to take pictures of it and send those pictures to NASA, who will now claim ownership of those things because there's been a transfer of ownerships through the company putting those resources somewhere, right? And this would be legal precedent that it's possible to do an in-orbit transfer that doesn't amount to appropriation. The thing that upsets me the most is that at the Space Symposium last year, there was like a big photo opportunity with Lunar Outpost and NASA because they won that contract, and it's a $1 contract. It's $1. So because it's not so much about the money, it's about the legal precedent. So they were taking photos with this check that NASA gave to Lunar Outpost for 10 cents because you get 10% of the check up front. The frustrating thing for me is like, how can you use a $1 contract for an international legal precedent? We're talking about the resources of the universe that you want to say it's possible to do this. And you use a $1 contract, which to me is anti-competitive because no one else would have been able to compete to maybe say, well, we want to create a different kind of precedent through this, right? Do you get where I'm going with this?
That's a good point, right? If it's only $1, you have no funding to actually do it. So you have to believe that you can do it without it.
It's only like someone who is extremely well-resourced, that doesn't care about the money, that is going to be able to be part of a contract that you want to use as legal precedent for the entire world.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Sorry, I'm quite passionate about that example.
No, it's good. I think we're about out of time. So did you have any final comments?
So my closing remarks is what I hope you guys took away from this, remembering that this is a conference. The way we saw this is a conference about space education and showing the different ways of education. This is how I educate my students. We basically take a bunch of issues that are happening and just talk through it, right? And the interesting thing about space, and I think the only way that you can really do this is through this dialogue, because no one perspective has the answer. even people that have been studying space law for like 30 years may not have the answer about what the future regime should look like, right? So so if you're talking about educating people, if you're talking about actually getting things done, it's conversations like me and Lindsay have these conversations like every so often. And it's just like, okay, what are you learning? What are you working on? How does that affect what we already know? How does that change the model that we're talking about for space governance? That's just the way we do our thing. And I do want to end, Lindsay, with, you know, your thoughts as to this approach, like my way of doing space education compared to all the other experiences you've had, you know, obviously as someone who's had a scientific pathway with an interest in policy and governance.
No, I think it's been incredibly helpful, right? Because it means that I've realized quite how open-ended things are. And because space governance is so open-ended and so undefined and constantly evolving, I think that in this area, it is often more important to have examples that I can pull from and have conversations about a lot of different areas rather than just, you know, memorizing the Outer Space Treaty. Memorizing the Outer Space Treaty is one thing, but what's a lot more important is to be able to draw from these examples and have these discussions, because nothing that's written down in space law and policy is truly defined right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you for all your questions and the engagement. We really appreciated this. It was a lot of fun. As you can see, we're very passionate about our topic. Please, Lindsay's given you her email address. You can use that to reach out to me as well. Any questions further that you have, any projects that you want, you know, support on, we are here to help. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone. We're out of time, unfortunately, but we invite everybody to attend any of our following sessions. Thank you, Timibi. Thank you, Lindsay. This was a great discussion. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.